July 21st, 1683, Tower Hill, London. A man kneels before a jeering crowd, his hands bound, his face pale but defiant. This is Lord William Russell, accused of treason against King Charles II. His executioner, Jack Ketch, stands beside him, gripping a massive axe. The moment arrives. The blade swings, but instead of a clean death, the axe misses its mark. Russell screams in agony as Ketch lifts the axe again and again. It takes 4 brutal blows before his head is finally severed from his body. The crowd recoils in horror, but Jack merely wipes the blood from his hands, knowing his work is far from over. In medieval times, executioners were feared, hated, and necessary all at once. But who were these men who held the power of life and death? Were they cold-blooded killers, or simply doing the job that society demanded? And just how would they go in carrying out the will of kings, the wrath of mobs, and the cruelty of medieval justice? Before executioners became a profession, there was only vengeance. In the earliest human societies, justice wasn't carried out by officials or kings. It was personal. If one man killed another, the victim's family sought revenge, spilling blood in a cycle that could go on for generations. But as civilizations grew, so did the need for order. Governments, monarchs, and ruling classes realized that revenge killings led to chaos. If they wanted control, they had to be the ones to decide who lived and who died. So instead of endless feuds, punishment became a public display, one that didn't just serve justice, but instilled fear. It wasn't enough to kill criminals, rebels, and traitors. They had to be made into an example. The execution had to be slow, painful, and most importantly, seen. By the Middle Ages, executions had evolved into something beyond punishment. They were a statement, and in many ways, they were a performance. The ruler, whether a king, an emperor, or a religious leader, needed to make sure everyone watching understood one thing: defiance would not be tolerated. So the punishments grew darker. Thieves didn't just serve time, they lost their hands. Murderers weren't simply executed, they were hanged in public, their bodies left to rot as a message to others. And traitors, they faced the most gruesome fate of all, often being drawn and quartered, their remains scattered as a chilling reminder that betrayal would not go unpunished. But someone had to carry out these acts. Someone had to wield the blade, set the fire, tighten the noose, and that was where the executioner came in. At first, there was no official role, just men who were chosen for the task, often criminals themselves given a grim choice: die on the scaffold or work on it. Others inherited the position from their fathers, their family names forever tied to the business of death. And some, surprisingly, took the job willingly, knowing that despite the stain it carried, it also came with a steady income. With the rise of public executions, the executioner's job became something else entirely. Word would spread quickly when someone was sentenced to death, and when the day arrived, crowds would flood into the city square, eager for the show. They'd gather in the early hours, bringing their children, buying food from vendors, turning the event into something between a punishment and a festival. The executioner wasn't just a bringer of death, he was a performer. A clean, swift beheading or a well-timed hanging could earn him respect. The people wanted to see suffering. If a death was too quick, they felt cheated, and if it was too slow, they jeered at the executioner, blaming him for robbing them of a proper spectacle. It was a strange paradox. Executioners were among the most feared men in medieval society, yet they were also indispensable. They did what no one else dared to do, and despite being despised, the same people who shunned them in life would cheer for them at the scaffold. Over time, the executioner became more than just a man with an axe. He became a symbol of power, of fear, of fate itself. And for the men who held the blade, it was both a curse and a profession. Some saw themselves as nothing more than functionaries of the law, carrying out their duty without emotion. Others took a darker path, reveling in the power they held over life and death. But all of them, in the end, would be judged by the blood they spilled. No one dreamed of becoming an executioner. It wasn't a career path like blacksmithing or carpentry. No young boy looked up at the scaffold and said, "That's what I want to do when I grow up." Yet generation after generation, the profession endured. Training was brutal, and it began early. A young apprentice, often the son of an executioner, had to learn every method of punishment at his father's side. There was no room for error. The executioner's reputation depended on his efficiency, and mistakes could be deadly for both the condemned and the man wielding the axe. One of the most infamous executioners in history, Franz Schmidt, kept meticulous records of his work. Unlike the brutal men before him, he saw execution as a necessary but solemn duty. Over his lifetime, he carried out 361 executions, documenting each one in chilling detail. He believed in justice, even if he was the one who had to deliver it. Some relished the power they held over life and death. Jack Ketch, the infamous English executioner, became known for his incompetence and cruelty. His name became a curse whispered among the condemned. When a nobleman was sentenced to death, he'd often bribe the executioner for a swift and painless end. With Ketch, that money was wasted. The beheading of James Scott, 1st Duke of Monmouth in 1685, was one of the worst executions in history. The first swing of Ketch's axe missed entirely. The second barely cut through the skin. The crowd watched in horror as the Duke writhed on the scaffold, his agony stretching on for what felt like eternity. It took 5 blows before the job was finally done. An executioner was only as good as his tools. A clean, precise strike could mean the difference between a swift death and a prolonged nightmare. But in the Middle Ages, justice wasn't always about efficiency. Sometimes it was about suffering. The tools of the executioner weren't just instruments of death, they were symbols of power, fear, and control. From the weight of the executioner's axe to the horrors of the breaking wheel, each device had a purpose. The most iconic of all was the executioner's sword. Unlike battlefield weapons, these blades were broad and heavy, crafted specifically for beheadings. The ideal executioner was skilled enough to sever a head in one clean stroke. Not all executioners had the skill to do their job well. Jack Ketch, infamous for his botched executions, proved just how much could go wrong. When Lord Russell was sentenced to beheading in 1683, he prepared himself for death with dignity. But Ketch's first swing only grazed his neck. The second strike cut deeper, but still didn't sever the head. By the third, Russell was gasping in agony, blood pouring from his body as the crowd looked on in horror. This time, it took 4 blows before Ketch finally finished the job. The axe and sword were reserved for nobles, but for common criminals, death came in crueler forms. The gallows was the executioner's most common tool. A simple rope could end a life in seconds if done correctly, snapping the neck instantly. But many hangings weren't meant to be swift. If the drop was too short, the condemned would strangle slowly, their feet kicking in the air as they fought for breath. A skilled executioner knew exactly how much slack to give, but mistakes were common. Some prisoners took minutes, sometimes even an hour, to die. Then there was the breaking wheel, one of the most feared methods of execution. Unlike a beheading or hanging, the wheel wasn't designed for a quick death. It was designed for pain. The condemned was strapped onto the wooden wheel, their limbs spread apart. The executioner would take a heavy iron bar and smash their arms and legs one by one, shattering bones while the victim remained alive. Sometimes the executioner would show mercy by delivering a final blow to the chest, ending the suffering. Other times, they were left on the wheel, their broken bodies displayed for days, until they finally succumbed to their injuries. The worst punishments were reserved for traitors. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was one of the most infamous. And then came the guillotine, the tool that changed everything. During the French Revolution, execution became industrialized. The guillotine didn't require skill, just gravity. The blade fell, and in less than a second, the condemned was dead. Charles-Henri Sanson, the executioner of Paris, performed thousands of beheadings with it, including the execution of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. It was said that in those final moments, even kings looked up at the blade with the same terror as the lowest of criminals. For centuries, these tools shaped the course of justice. They determined who lived, who died, and how much they suffered along the way. But no matter how refined the methods became, the executioner's job remained the same. He was the final hand of the law, the one who turned sentences into reality. No matter how skilled an executioner was, no matter how necessary his job, society never fully accepted him. Executioners lived in the shadows. They were both feared and shunned, treated as something less than human. Townspeople needed them to carry out justice. But when the blood was cleaned from the scaffold, no one wanted to stand too close. In many cities, executioners were forced to live outside the walls, their homes built on the fringes of society. Some were barred from entering churches, and their families carried the stain of their profession for generations. Some tried to disguise themselves. It wasn't uncommon for executioners to wear masks or hoods, hiding their identities from the crowds. not just to protect themselves, but to preserve what little dignity they had left. Yet, despite being treated as outcasts, executioners had unique privileges. Many were paid well, far more than the average laborer. Some were even given land and property in exchange for their work. They lived in isolation, but they were never poor. Charles-Henri Sanson, the executioner of Paris, understood this strange paradox well. His family had been in the trade for generations, and while he was respected for his efficiency, he was still considered untouchable by polite society. Even as he carried out thousands of executions, including the beheading of King Louis XVI, he was never truly accepted. His hands had taken too many lives to be seen as anything other than a necessary evil. The executioner's role was a contradiction. He was both an instrument of justice and a walking reminder of death. Society needed him, but it never embraced him. And for many, the only way to escape the stigma was to pass the burden to their sons, ensuring that the cycle of blood would continue for another generation. Executions weren't just punishments, they were performances. The ritual began long before the blade fell. In many cases, condemned prisoners were paraded through the streets, forced to walk their final path while the crowd jeered and cursed. Some were given the chance for a last confession, their final words meant to cleanse their soul before death. Others were denied even that mercy. The executioner followed a strict set of traditions. In some places, it was customary for him to ask for forgiveness from the condemned before the act was carried out. It was a final, hollow gesture, one that rarely brought comfort. The audience always played a role. They cheered, gasped, sometimes even begged for mercy on the prisoner's behalf, but most of the time they simply watched. And when it was over, when the body was discarded or put on display, they moved on with their lives, already waiting for the next execution. For the executioner, however, the spectacle never ended. He would clean his tools, remove the blood from his hands, and prepare for the next name on the list. Because as long as there were crimes, betrayals, and kings in need of vengeance, his work would never be finished. For centuries, executioners were seen as necessary evils, men who carried out the dirty work of kings and courts, but were never fully accepted by society. They were feared, shunned, and forced to live on the fringes. But over time, their role began to change. But as societies grew more structured, so did the role of the executioner. By the 16th and 17th centuries, executioners had become state officials, tasked not just with carrying out sentences, but also with upholding law and order. Some even performed medically sanctioned executions, where doctors and officials carefully monitored the process to ensure a humane death, or at least one that served the law's interests. Franz Schmidt, one of history's most famous executioners, saw himself as more than just a killer. Unlike executioners who relished the brutality, Schmidt believed in justice and redemption. He even used his position to help free the innocent, proving that not all men in his profession were heartless. With each passing century, executioners became less like outcasts and more like bureaucrats. Their names were no longer whispered in fear, and their role in society was no longer shrouded in secrecy. By the 19th and 20th centuries, many countries had abolished public executions, and the once feared executioner became a faceless government official, carrying out sentences behind closed doors. And then, slowly, the profession began to disappear entirely. As modern societies moved away from capital punishment, the executioner, a figure who had once been both hated and indispensable, became obsolete. The scaffold was abandoned, the axe put away, and the final generations of executioners faded into history. But the legacy of their work remains. Their names are still spoken, their deeds still remembered. Because while the executioner may have disappeared, the blood they spilled has left a mark that will never be erased. For centuries, executioners stood at the crossroads of justice and cruelty. They were the final hand of the law, the enforcers of punishment, the ones who ensured that criminals, traitors, and the condemned paid the ultimate price. But were they servants of justice or merchants of death? Some, like Franz Schmidt, saw themselves as professionals, men who carried out their duties with precision and fairness. Others, like Jack Ketch, reveled in their power, dragging executions out in a display of incompetence or sadism. And then there were figures like Charles-Henri Sanson, who executed thousands in the name of revolution, including the very king he once served. Executioners were feared, yet society needed them. They were despised, yet their work was essential. They lived as outcasts, yet their hands shaped history. Without them, laws had no teeth, justice had no finality, power had no consequences. What do you think? Did they believe in what they were doing? Or did they simply accept the burden because someone had to? And if you lived in those times, could you have done their job? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to uncover more of history's darkest professions, subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories of nefarious deeds throughout history.